Well, welcome to this episode of Capital Decanted. I am delighted to have my friend and a prolific author, one of my favorite authors, Sebastian Mallaby, who is the senior fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations. Sebastian, welcome to the show.
Thank you, John. It's great to be with you.
Well, it is always a pleasure. It's an honor. As I've said, some of my very favorite books you've been the author of, and we're going to get to that next one, which I'm sure will join the list. Listeners, we're going to kind of take this in two parts. They are interrelated parts, but maybe two chapters within this episode of Capital Decanted. Sebastian was kind enough to participate in one of 8 leadership forums around the world last year that Kaya held. In my first year as CEO, I wanted to engage with those that were kind of at the wheel and at the levers of the global capital market system to get a sense for where they thought the world was going. And excitingly, what we've done is collate and draw out a through line of the major themes of what we learned across those 8 different sessions, 130 professionals in the C-suite, 20 plus hours of discussion. And I'm going to be kind of bringing to life through Sebastian's wisdom some of what we heard in both the London version, which he participated in, and the other 7. We're also going to talk about, which is interestingly very related, Sebastian's new book, his forthcoming book on AI called The Infinity Machine. So we're actually going to start with that. So these two will be, I think, more related than maybe perhaps we even thought when we first met. So Sebastian, let's talk about that. Let's start with the book. At the time that this episode drops, as we were just talking about, we'll be about a week away, as I understand it, from the release, March 31st, of your new book. And I'd love for the audience to hear what I've heard previously, which is what was the kind of the catalyst or insight that led to this new passion that got you interested in AI?
Well, in the case of this book, it's really very simple. I mean, I think artificial intelligence is the most important transformation going on in the world right now. It could be bigger than the Industrial Revolution. It really could be one of the biggest transformations, if you think about it, in all of human history. I mean, the arrival of a new form of cognition into the world. I mean, that doesn't get bigger than that. So the subject was sort of obvious to me. And, I was thinking about this in middle of 2022. ChatGPT had not come out yet, but there had been other signs of major progress, both in language models and in things like protein folding. And that got me to thinking about who would be the central character of the story. And Demis Hassabis, this North London sort of chess prodigy turned computer coder, entrepreneur, neuroscience PhD, and then AI, is just the most fascinating character I know in this space. He has a Nobel Prize now. He is so kind of broad in his interests and the way he looks at the world. And interestingly, he became convinced in the potential of building superhuman intelligence back in the 90s when he was 17. And so just that sort of stick-to-itiveness, that early vision is something I wanted to capture.
Well, it's interesting. I watched the kind of dramatized documentary on a recent United flight, so I got a little bit more familiar with him after you had clued me into him being your main protagonist. I'm interested, however, the books that I fell in love with that drew me to you were The Power Law and More Money Than God, where you focused on my part of the world, hedge funds and venture capital in those cases. Those models of those books is that you chose lots of protagonists because there were these case studies per chapter of different icons in that particular subject that brought to life a chronology and a coming of age of that asset class. At least those are my words, not yours. And yet in this case, you chose one individual and you could have chosen many within AI. So I'm curious how that came together versus maybe the other models you did in previous books.
Well, you are exactly right that, there's 2 ways of doing this kind of thing. There's the story of an asset class where you ride different personalities in different chapters. And if you're telling a long history, so with The Power Law, I start in the 50s and 60s and I go right the way up to sort of 2020, there is no single individual, who dominated that industry for the whole period. On the other hand, when I wrote about the making of modern finance, I picked this one figure, Alan Greenspan, whose life had gone from, a completely regulated financial system in the 1950s right up until the '08 crisis. And so through one person's career, you could tell the story of the making of modern finance. And with AI, it just so happened I got lucky, right? There is this character who was thinking about AI deeply in the '90s and the 2000s before AI could recognize a cat. It couldn't recognize a cat picture. Nothing worked. And yet he had this determination that it was going to work. And so through Demis Hassabis's career and his intellectual story, one sees how this thing goes from being a kind of glimmer in the eye, something which ought to happen but hadn't happened, and then it actually happens. So I think here there was just this one super compelling story, and he's just a fun person to get to know and to write about. And I think the reader will enjoy this. He is the best narrator of his own experience that I've ever encountered. I mean, I've had, 35 years of writing books about fascinating people. He is the most fascinating. Just to give you one little taste of this, I said to him, right, so you founded your company DeepMind, which was later bought by Google, and it's 2010. You've just raised the money from Peter Thiel, and you've gotten your first office in London. How did that feel? And I know from experience that normally you ask somebody to recapture the emotion and the feeling of something which happened 15 years ago, and you get, yeah, it was cool. That's all you get. But with Demis, he's like, well, you understand, Sebastian, that down the street there was the London Mathematical Society, right? Just a couple of doors from my office, which of course is where Alan Turing laid the foundation of computer science and the idea of AI. And now I'm completing that story. So that was symmetrical. And then, Sebastian, you have to understand also that there was a particular place where you can cross the street, cross the road. And there is one of those pedestrian crossings that goes black, white, black, white. And as this Hungarian nuclear theorist in the 1930s was crossing that black, white, he thought of the nuclear chain reaction, and that's what led to the Manhattan Project. And of course, AI is existential, like the Manhattan Project. And so it was such an appropriate place. I mean, he tells his story in a way that I can just give him the microphone, and he's talking on the page, and he's riffing, and it's mesmerizing. So that's why he was just the obvious character to carry the whole story.
Yeah, I can see why he might have just drawn you in, magnetic in many ways. You also, however, talked to some of his competitors, maybe that, and some that maybe didn't think quite as highly of him as others. So I don't want to ruin or or spoil the story, because readers, you should definitely get this book. But I'd be curious, what was kind of the biggest surprise? If there was a headline moment or revelation through the process, either with Demis or with any of the others you talked about, was there something that kind of really struck you?
I think one of the really interesting parts of the modern history of AI is the way that DeepMind was the leading lab until basically ChatGPT came out in 2022. And then you have this moment when OpenAI is in the lead. Now, DeepMind has caught up again. The Gemini model from Google DeepMind is ranked as the best, although it's very close between Anthropic and OpenAI and so on. But you have this moment when the leader gets dethroned. And I wanted to understand what happened. What went wrong? Why did Demis Hassabis not manage to retain the lead? And it comes down, as he explained it to me in these long conversations we would have. I would meet him for 2 hours at a time in a weird little pub in North London. And we'd find a room where there was nobody else, and he would just riff at me for 2 hours. And he explained that the reason he missed the idea of large language models and ChatGPT was that his theory of intelligence held that language is just a system of symbols. It's not really the deep key to what makes people intelligent. When you learn as a human being, you act in the world, you get feedback from your environment, and you do trial and error, and that's a big part of how you learn stuff. Whereas with large language models, they're trained on lots of data and they don't really interact. I mean, it's beginning now with agents. But, between 2022 and 2025, say, there was no interaction going on. And so Demis just missed the significance of language as a component of intelligence. And he had these debates with other computer scientists at the time. Some of them would say, look, the biggest intellectual breakthrough of the 20th century was Einstein and the theory of relativity. Einstein did thought experiments. It was totally in his head. He came up with this incredible idea. It was not grounded in the real world or in trial and error feedback. So if Einstein can do that, and that's amazing. Why couldn't a large language model do the same thing? And so Demis would debate this back and forth. And I think, this just gives a little window on how the quest for superhuman intelligence is kind of a debate about cognition, a debate about what it means to be intelligent, and therefore what we've learned, what we've experienced so far as, what it is to be human.
Fascinating, really fascinating. Well, I can't wait to read it. My signed copy, Sebastian. I must say,
Absolutely.
at some point we'll have to figure out.
Coming your way.
Yeah, very good. Well, as I've already kind of alluded to, Sebastian, in some ways you're this awesome personification of this intersection between my world, capitalism and private capital, and now AI, based upon your studies and your authorship. And so I'm curious first at a high level, when you think about the investment profession's implications after all of this work on AI, where on this stack of AI opportunity do you think is most monetizable, most kind of has the most staying power? We've heard a lot of these comparisons to the dot-com bubble and kind of laying the rails is all that the big models are, and that eventually the euphoria will give way to kind of consumer applications that sit on top of them. That's one approach. But I'm just curious, as you think about the opportunity for the investment profession, where do you think the most benefit will come from?
Well, let me tell you a couple of things about that. I think the first thing is at a high level, with the arrival of this incredible machine for cognition and analysis, we humans have to think, well, what are we good at? What's our distinctive comparative advantage? And I think it's really two things. One is goal setting, right? We don't really want the machines to set goals for us. So whether we're talking about a politician who's a head of state, or a chief executive who's running a company, or somebody who's running a section of a company, I think that high level goal setting is going to remain human. And the other thing is human to human interaction is surely something which humans have an advantage at. I mean, I know that a lot of people depend on large language models these days for various kinds of companionship and therapy. So you can't discount the machines in terms of their ability to be emotionally intelligent. But I think at the end of the day, the most satisfying sort of emotional interaction and bonding that you can get is with another person that is a biological intelligence, not a silicon one. And so I think what that means for the investment space is that you know investors in some categories, for example, in venture capital, it's very much a human to human thing. The asset class that you're investing in is the entrepreneur. It's a human being who can get up from the table and walk away and then even run away. And if you don't bond with them and you make them want to run away, you're not going to be able to invest in them, right? So that sort of human networking, I think you double down on as a venture capitalist. And then the goal setting, obviously, is something else that in an investment firm you need to do, and humans will do that. And maybe just also imagining the future. I mean, to some extent, investing is about imagining what consumers are going to want next year or in 3 years. And machines can do some of that, but I think humans have the edge in just sort of putting themselves in the shoe of some future consumer. Um, so I think that's what I would say about how investment professionals can remain value add. I think another part of your question, though, is about a slightly different thing, which is where in the investment stack, where in the AI stack should one invest? Is that right? Did I get that right?
Yes.
Um, because I think there, it's a very interesting debate right now. Is there an AI bubble? Is it like the .com, as you said, John? And my take is that we don't have an AI bubble in the sense that I think the systems are getting better and better and stronger, and so they're going to grow into the extraordinary valuations that they have now. I think there might be a specific bubble in OpenAI because OpenAI is not attached to a deep pocket, right? Unlike the Google Gemini system, which can be financed by incredible retained earnings by Google. OpenAI is out there by itself, and unlike Anthropic is also by itself, but it's kept its cost down a lot more, and it's monetizing, I think, with a lot more focus in terms of enterprise applications. So I think there can be disruptions. Some companies might stumble. I think OpenAI is the most obvious candidate. But as a general matter, I don't think the whole AI sector is in a bubble. Therefore, I think that you need to look at which part of the stack has the most defensible moat. And I would say it's almost sort of like you start with the lithography machine, which is printing the semiconductors, right? And you look at that and you say, okay, ASML, the Dutch company, has pretty much a monopoly globally on this product. That is a very defensible moat. I think that's a good bet. Then you go one layer along and you say, okay, let's look at the GPUs. NVIDIA is extremely strong. Others are going to try and compete, of course, but I think it remains pretty investable. Then you're one layer up again, and you're looking at the foundation models. Now, here I think there's going to be some attrition because there's a lot of foundation model builders out there. But I think that as time goes by, the models will get stickier. Why? Because the models are going to remember every conversation that users had with them. The models are going to have your credit card and go shopping for you. And it's going to be a pain in the neck to switch to a different model that doesn't know you, doesn't have your credit card details. So I think, maybe OpenAI doesn't make it because it doesn't have deep pockets enough to kind of get all the way there. But some foundation model builders, they will make it. And then if you go beyond that to the application layer, I'm quite pessimistic because there, it seems to me, there are tons of contenders. There isn't really a very clear moat. And, as we are seeing just recently, SaaS software companies have had a really hard time because the idea that they are going to be able to sort of bring AI into the SaaS and therefore get stickiness is competing with the rival idea, which is that Anthropic is going to be AI native and is going to build SaaS equivalents much more effectively.
Mm. That switching cost point is very interesting on the foundation models. I think for the average consumer, the average user, it's probably eventually a commodity. But that's really interesting what you said is that even though the average person probably couldn't tell the rigor and the robustness of one model versus another, the fact that they've got so much invested intellectually and cognitively and history is a very good point. I want to return to the first part of your answer, which is on the investment professional, because one of the themes that came out overwhelmingly, in fact, it's going to be one of our three kind of headline themes, the organizational implications of AI on the org design and the type of talent recruiting. And we heard words like agility and multidisciplinary capability and judgment. These are softer, holistic skills, right brain stuff. That's because skills training, the argument would go, is becoming very easy to access. It's becoming commoditized. And so you need people that can think across different disciplines and data sets and make judgments on them. If you buy that kind of preface generally, Sebastian, what does that mean for the composition of competencies across an investment asset management firm in the future?
Well, I think I'd put it slightly differently. And I think that the key thing is to have leaders at investment firms that are willing to experiment with AI applications, trial and error, iterate, figure out how they can be made to work the best for you, and then be really ruthless and tough about restructuring the organization around what you discover, and then potentially restructuring it again 18 months later because the AI has changed and you need to change the org again. So I think it's kind of, relentless adaptation is going to be the watchword. You alluded to something else, which sort of sounds right, which is, people who can work across disciplines and synthesize things. Of course, that's good, but I'm always impressed when I use the models, and they get better all the time. How much they can do that? They can think across subjects. They can make analogies. They can, one of the best exercises I think you can do with a large language model, in my experience, is to say, well, I'm a US citizen and a UK citizen. I pay taxes in both places. Compare and contrast the two tax systems. Tell me how the following, tax question would net out across the two. I mean, so that involves being an expert in two things at once. They are excellent at that, right? Because humans, there's only so much they can have in their head. The machines are almost infinite. I think that is less unique than the toughness of being willing to kind of constantly update the org chart.
Right. So, so I want to get back to leaders in a minute because I think that relentless adaptation phrase is really interesting and spot on. We heard a lot just back to kind of junior and mid level uh, that there was a little bit of reticence, or perhaps a sense that they could replace much of the lower levels of the org chart leaders with AI models, because a lot of those tasks. And by the way, I should just say, as a quick commercial break, the financial industry is horrible at professional development. Not only do we not focus on it, but we have been using the same playbook for 50 years. We go to the Ivy Leagues, we have the 2-year investment bank training. Even the Kayas of the world have been grown up on teaching skills. And so part of this is looking in the mirror, Sebastian, too, is that in order for us to right size and continue to make young talent attractive, do we need to completely rethink how we shape and form the anatomy of these young individuals?
One lens through which I've thought about this question is actually commercial law firms. My 25-year-old son happens to work for one, which is why I've thought about it. But, this law firm that he works for in London recruits sort of 80 24-year-olds, 25-year-olds each year. And then if you look kind of 7 years later, a large proportion have left. There's really quite high attrition. But from the law firm's perspective, you might say, well, why are they training all these people and then they only keep, 7 out of 80? Well, the answer is twofold. First of all, you need great people to lead the organization in the future, and you're willing to bring in 80 to get the 7 you really want, because the whole future of the company, the partnership, depends on that. And the young people are cheap, right, relative to what the partners cost. So you can afford 80. It's actually not that expensive. But then the second thing, which is, I think, maybe underestimated, is that where do those other 73 go in my example, right? The other 73 who didn't stay at the law firm, well, they go in-house as lawyers in various corporations, and then they turn around, they want outside counsel. Guess who they turn to? Their old friends at the firm. And maybe in the investment firm example, I mean, I'm not sure if this is right, but perhaps you recruit a bunch of 25-year-olds, and not all of them stay. You don't need all of them. Some of it's a bit redundant, but it's quite cheap. And then you find that a couple of these people go off and work for an endowment, and they're allocators. And it's kind of nice to have an allocator at a big endowment who happens to be your former employee. So I think network entrenchment is an underappreciated benefit of hiring young professionals.
The network entrenchment, I think that is a good way to punctuate that point. Okay, so like I said, I want to finish by moving back to the leadership point you made. So you talked about experimentation, particularly with the org chart and some of these AI applications and use cases, and you talked about relentless adaptation. Is there anything else you would say about the future CEO of an asset manager or a GP on what types of skills and makeup and maybe even tendencies they need to have, particularly in this new world where AI is ubiquitous?
I'd actually say that when I wrote my books about hedge funds and venture capital, way before AI was a factor, really. What I concluded in those books was that the most successful investors were super adaptable because markets change, right? Something which generates a lot of alpha in the 90s doesn't generate alpha in the 2000s because it's been arbitraged out. Because, let's say you were doing macro trades and, you could short currency pegs, attack currency pegs very profitably in the 90s. But then the central banks get wise and they don't give you currency pegs anymore, right? They go for flexible exchange rates. So these kinds of things are constantly happening, and you have to think up new sources of alpha. So I'd say that the adaptability quality, which is very closely related to just like the relentless curiosity, the relentless desire to learn new stuff, to update yourself, refresh yourself. And that just becomes even more true in the age of AI, because now you're not merely trying to keep up with changes in markets about where the alpha might be hiding, but also changes in the method because you've got this amazing new cognitive tool.
Mm.
But I think deep down, curiosity is the common trait in all of the history of investing, and that hasn't changed.
Yeah, indeed. I think we talk about curiosity a lot, but I think the days of faking or masquerading with your curiosity are probably over. You have to express it now and live it. So I think that's a very good way to end it, Sebastian. So listeners, you've got a couple big releases coming. You've got the Kaya report on the future of the capital market system, Rewired, the next decade of capital markets on March 25th. And then about a week later, you've got Sebastian's book, The Infinity Machine. So be sure to check both of those out. Sebastian, it is always a pleasure. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, John. I really enjoyed it.